Hi, this is Dr. Thomas Armstrong. Welcome to week 7 of the course Introduction to Neurodiversity, a strength-based approach to special education. In Module 7, we're going to be addressing the strengths of autism.
The two books that we're using for this course are my two books on neurodiversity. The first one is The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and that's focused mostly on adult neurodiversity. And my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life. And that book is more applicable to kindergarten through 12th grade education.
But first, I'd like you to do some reflection. I'd like you to think back to the first time you became aware of the concept of autism. Was it something you read or heard about, or maybe you knew of someone who had autism? And what was your initial reaction? Okay. We're going to be using the same 7 components of positive niche construction that I've been using to organize the other recent modules. So first, we're going to look at the strengths and how we can develop a strength awareness of autism disorders. At the base of the autism spectrum disorders, according to Simon Baron-Cohen, we have sensory sensitivities. These can include visual acuity. I thought it was interesting that not only do they see well approaching that of birds of prey, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. Many of them have extraordinary auditory acuity, which of course is a problem in a world of technological devices that screech and howl and moan. But I suspect that in hunting and gathering societies, that auditory acuity was probably an advantage to be able to listen for oncoming weather or animals in the wild or invading camps, etc. Also, there's often reported a hypersensitivity to touch. We noticed that in the New Yorker article for this week. Temple Grandin indicated how difficult it was for her to be touched. Regarding olfactory sensitivity, we have less evidence, but Baron-Cohen indicated that research is going on in that area. Now, Baron-Cohen also says that sensory sensitivities give rise to a gift for detail. If you're hyper-aware through all of your sensorium of the external environment, that's going to give you knowledge about teeny little things that can have big effects on you. So I like to say that people on the spectrum are Where's Waldo people. They can find Waldo more quickly than the average person, although I'm not aware of any studies per se that have tested this using the Waldo puzzles. But we do know through other research that they are good at finding details. This has particular importance in today's high-tech society when it comes to computer code, because one little thing put out of place could wreck the whole code. And many people on the spectrum have that capability to find mistakes in computer code. We'll come back to this a little later. But again, this might have important adaptational advantages in hunting and gathering societies. To be able to notice something like a drop of water on a leaf, indicating that there is water in the region, might be a way of saving the lives of a whole people. You will read the Oliver Sacks New Yorker article, and when Sacks and Temple Grandin were out together, Dr. Sacks wanted to stop for a swim, and he went in the water, and just then Temple Grandin noticed in the surface of the far distant water a kind of a rushing, and she warned him to get out. And as it turned out, this water was heading to a hydroelectric dam about a half a mile away. So she literally saved his life with that visual acuity, that attention to detail. A gift for detail involves enhanced perceptual functioning. People on the spectrum do better than typically developing people on something called the embedded figures task, where you look at the triangle at the upper left-hand quadrant of this picture, and you find the triangle embedded in the more complicated drawing of the baby buggy, and similarly for the bottom two shapes. People on the spectrum often do better than typically developing people on the objects assembly task, a visual spatial task, which is on the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which is an IQ test, which is the IQ test used most often with kids. They also do better on another IQ test called the Raven's Progressive Matrices. In fact, if you have a choice between IQ tests to give to someone on the spectrum, it's much more advisable to give them the Raven's Progressive Matrices, because it's largely nonverbal and involves this perceptual look for patterns. And I guess you can see here at the top, you look at the sequence of the squares and how the black square within the square moves around. Then you look at the circles and how the black moves around. And then you have to look at the diamonds and predict what the third diamond is going to look like and where the black square is going to be, assuming there is a black square. I'm not going to give away the answer. Now all this, according to Baron Cohen, all this sensory sensitivity, gift for detail, enhanced perceptual functioning really builds up to something that is really higher order. One can argue, sensory sensitivities is that's a trait that's at a very basic level. Infants have sensory sensitivities, so what's so great about that? Well, what's so great about that is that individuals on the spectrum, by having these sensitivities and gifts for detail and perceptual functioning abilities, develop a high capacity for systemizing. Now let me stop here for a moment and define what I mean by systemizing, or what Baron Cohen means by it. Throughout his article that we're reading for this week, he makes a point of an algorithm that is tacitly used by individuals who are navigating systems. And that algorithm goes like this: if P, then S. So there's an input, which is P, in this case, a picture of a tree. Then in the middle, there's an operation of some kind. It could be any kind of operation. I've just put in turn, the operation is turn 90 degrees. Then the output becomes S, the picture turned on its head 90 degrees. So essentially, systemizing involves lots of these if P then S kinds of computations or logical analysis. And Baron Cohen suggests that this kind of systemizing goes on in many different kinds of systems. He talks about collectible systems. So a coin collection could be like that. Let's see, if I have a picture of a woman with a crown on her head, that means I put it in this book instead of that book. If it says 14 on it, 1914, I put it in the 1914 hole, unless it has a D right near the neck. So you see how the algorithm can work, either explicitly or in most cases implicitly. There are mechanical systems like a car engine. So if I hear a certain noise, then I know to lean in, do an operation, turn a couple of screws, then I know it's the carburetor. I'm not a big auto guy, so my example is not so good, but you get the idea. Calendars and schedules are also systems. I know if it's 10 o'clock in the morning and I look and I see the flight to Barcelona or the train to Barcelona leaves at 12:39, that I have 2 hours and 39 minutes until the train leaves. So I'm operating on that schedule. There are musical systems. If I put a note here, then I get a certain sound from a piano. There are natural systems such as weather patterns. If I see a certain kind of configuration in the sky, then I know it might rain, or it might be a windy day, or it might be there's an eclipse on the horizon. There are also hierarchical structures, such as for company management. If I'm the chairman, then I report to the vice president, if then. There are motoric systems. This is a sketch of how to do the rumba. So when I hear, or if I hear a particular sound or beat, then I move my foot this way, not that way. I move my right foot this way, my left foot that way. You shake it all about, then you do the hokey pokey. No, excuse me, I got a little carried away. So systemizing can take place on a high level. Many of the examples I gave you were rather lower order. But think of mathematics as a higher order numerical system, or computer programming languages. And you're looking at very complex systems that require for navigation lots of small links of if-then kinds of propositions. Individuals who have exceptionally high systemizing abilities who are also on the spectrum, we tend to call savants. The word used to be idiot savants. Remember, idiot was a term used for scoring at the lowest level on an IQ test. But we now call them simply savants, the most famous being the example of Raymond from the movie Rain Man, who had particular savant abilities in the numerical area. And about 10% of those who are on the spectrum have these extraordinary savant abilities to one degree or another in some area. In the area of picture organization or picture systems, this is a drawing that was done by Nadia, a girl on the spectrum who was 5 years old when she drew that. An example of a numerical savant is Daniel Tammet, a Britisher who has an extraordinary ability to manipulate numbers, a little bit like Raymond from the movie Rain Man. And he was able to, in front of an audience, work out the value of pi, pi, to 10,000 digits. And he could have gone on, but a few hours at a time is enough. He also had a linguistic savant ability, and that was his ability to teach himself Icelandic in 1 week and then go on an Icelandic television program and be interviewed for like 10 minutes in nothing but Icelandic. He wrote a wonderful autobiography called Born on a Blue Day that I really recommend you all get. Then systemizing, if you ratchet down a few levels from this extraordinary height, you ratchet down a few levels and it becomes special interests, which virtually all kids, teens, and adults have who are on the spectrum, particularly kids. And these special interests can involve all kinds of things. But the main idea is that the child just really is focused on finding out as much as they can about that particular topic. These special interests have traditionally been referred to in the scientific community as obsessions or fixations, which is really a deficit-oriented way of looking at something that, if we call it a special interest, becomes much more positive. Here's a list of some diverse special interests that I got from a book by Paula Kluth, K-L-U-T-H, who's written several fine books about, very practical books, about teaching kids on the spectrum from a growth or strength perspective. And these interests could be World War II propeller planes, toilet brushes, waist measurements, Rommel's Desert Wars, paper bags, tarantulas, deep fat fryers, yellow pencils, photocopiers, industrial fans, robots, bus timetables, and more. I mentioned this in an earlier module, but I just want to emphasize it here again, because Asperger really recognized the value, the practical career value of having special interests. He says, we can see in the autistic person far more clearly than with any normal child a predestination for a particular profession from earliest youth. A particular line of work often grows naturally out of his or her special abilities. There's also the issue of visual spatial skills, which are implied in some of the things I've already said, the ability to do well in the block design task, for example, to be able to rotate objects in your mind, to operate on them in that logical way. But just to reiterate that visual spatial strategies are one important way of working with individuals on the spectrum. And in our reading by Oliver Sacks, Temple Grandin reported that she used visual spatial, almost like movies, she said, to help her work out social situations, how to act in them without appearing awkward. In the Baron Cohen article, there was a reference to Rubik's Cube as an example of that visual spatial organization, and he noted one individual on the spectrum who was able to do Rubik's Cube in, I think it was, what was it again, 1 minute, 7 seconds, something like that. However, he did point out that the world's record was like 8 seconds. Can you imagine? And this was by somebody who not on the spectrum. Let's look at some of the positive role models for autism spectrum disorders. We've been talking about her all along this lecture, so Temple Grandin certainly deserves to be at the top of a person that anybody on the spectrum should know about. She's an animal scientist who's developed a third of the animal machinery used to guide cattle in slaughterhouses. And she has reported that she thinks like an animal. And think about it in terms of systemizing. Animals are predictable. They don't say, oh, I'm going to do something different today when somebody kicks me in the butt. No, they have the same way of reacting. And she's very hypersensitive to those small cues, that gift for detail that she has, to know when an animal may be freaking out, when they need something else to hide the threatening object or to move them along more swiftly. In one of her books, she talks about actually getting down on her legs and hands and looking at the chute that delivered in this case, pigs to the slaughterhouse, and she noticed that there was water on the ground around that was flashing light from the sun, and that these flashes were freaking them out. So she simply made a better railing that blocked out those reflections. And she's very successful, and of course now a major advocate for a strength-based perspective on autism. She's continually emphasized how so much negative has been said about it. It's about time that we look at the positives, especially since so many people with autism aren't in jobs and deserve to be in jobs that match their level of functioning. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was arguably the greatest or second greatest philosopher of the 20th century. I read a biography of his once, and he tried teaching, and he was a horrible teacher, absolutely horrible. And he chased kids around with his whacking stick, and that career didn't last too long. Bobby Fischer, the chess champion, is another example of someone who's on the spectrum. He's a systemizer when it comes to chess. If I move my queen here, then he might take my pawn, if then thinking. And he was the world champion for a while. He was often more well known, though, for his off-screen antics. He got into all kinds of verbal wars and fights with other chess players. And this held the news. In some cases, became more well known than his actual chess performance. Andy Warhol would belong on this list of autist role models. A previous student did a paper on Andy Warhol as a dyslexic, and I didn't realize that he was dyslexic. But I knew that he was probably on the spectrum because he had a very remote kind of way of behaving. He didn't look at you. He had rather macabre interests. And his approach was very unusual, very unconventional in taking soup cans and making art out of them. So he definitely belongs on the spectrum. Wittgenstein and Warhol are both pictured on that neurodiversity.com site where it says honoring different kinds of wiring. A little bit about assistive technologies and universal design for learning tools. We have a number of apps out there, quite a lot of them, that are called social stories, which take kids through social rituals and it shows them how to navigate their way through. And I think this one caught me. I'm not sure what app it's from, but The story goes, if I lose or break my device, then I won't have it anymore and I will really miss it. Here we have an if-then. And it suggests to me that if-then approaches to discipline or to what to do and what not to do during a social event may have an impact on helping these individuals cope in the social world. There are other social stories apps that let kids create their own stories. If they've gone on a trip, they can record, they can take pictures, they can write about it, they can have a voice auditory input and put it all together in a multimedia story. Robots are increasingly being used to teach kids on the spectrum social skills. The advantage here is that it's a machine that's doing the teaching, and a machine is predictable and is a system. And so you have an attraction to the robot while the robot is teaching you something that you actually badly need to learn, different ways of behaving socially. For lower functioning individuals, I don't really like that term, lower functioning, but one might say for individuals on the spectrum who also have intellectual disabilities or are non-speakers or have articulation problems, the use of an app like ProLoquo to Go might be an important contribution to their niche. ProLoquo to Go is an augmentative alternative communication device. There are a number of commands and requests on buttons, and the child simply presses a button and a synthesized voice will carry out the command. So they don't have to talk. They can just press a button and make their needs known. A few strength-based learning strategies. I discussed this one in an earlier module, but I just wanted to mention it again. Given the special interests of kids on the spectrum, one strategy might be to make them the resident expert in the classroom for their particular interest, the go-to guy that everybody can go to find out more about that particular interest or to ask questions. Now, it may be that nobody is interested, and unfortunately, a lot of kids on the spectrum have that sadness that something that they're so excited about, they can't get other people excited about. But that's the challenge. And a better way of orchestrating this might be for the teacher to let the child share their special interests during a show and tell period during the school day. Temple Grandin suggests that teachers take kids on the spectrum's special interests and weave a curriculum out of it. If the child has a special interest on clouds, for example, they can do a project, maybe a science fair project, where they examine their special interest in detail and then can actually show it at a science fair. Calendars would be an important part of any classroom involving kids on the spectrum. Calendars that allow kids to understand what has happened in the past, what's coming up, event calendars in particular, color-coded and in other ways organized so that they know what's coming up, not just for the month, but also a schedule for the day. In fact, it's probably a good idea for each kid on the spectrum to have their own personal daily schedules so that they can anticipate the structure and enjoy working within that particular system. When presenting material, when presenting curricula, the use of cognitive organizers can really be a plus if they're used in the right way. Here we're looking at the distinctions between a desert biome and a water biome. So first, look at the individual circles. The desert is hot, the water biome is humid, the desert biome has little plant life, the water biome has lots of plants, and then there are things that they share in common. So looking at all this and building it up from the individual to the general, that's the important thing, is to teach from the specific to the general, not from the general to the specific, and having it all available as an overview, as a total view of, as a system really, that the child can then interact with and engage with. Seems to be an important way to go. I think that the best instructional programs are often ones that are computerized, that have bright sounds and sights and lots of interaction, immediate feedback. And what's good about this for the child on the spectrum is that there's consistency, there's predictability. It's a system. If I press this button, then I get this result, etc. So this is actually from the reading remediation program Fast for Word, where kids learn phonological awareness in a fun way. You remember that Temple Grandin said how visual spatial skills really helped her greatly in the functioning of her life. And that suggests that visualization might be an important tool to use in the school. I've often complained that visualization is the most valuable, not used strategy in the classroom. It's so easily available. Just have kids read a passage from a book and then close their eyes and picture what they've read. And for some kids, including I think many on the spectrum, this is going to unlock a new world for them. If they're not already doing this, and maybe they are, what I find is that if the teacher isn't using visualization explicitly, the kids are going to do it anyway. And that's what we call daydreaming. Only they're going to be daydreaming about something that has nothing to do with the course. And again, I want to reiterate that the direction of movement in instruction, if a teacher is creating a lesson plan, should be from the specific to the general. So you might teach a course in anatomy. You wouldn't come into a course in anatomy and say, this is a skeleton, once it was a man or a woman. People who dig these up in the ground are archaeologists. I mean, those are general concepts. You'd want to do something more like, see this bone here? This is the collarbone. Has anybody here ever broken their collarbone? And then kids share their experiences. And now you have a sort of an area of interest that is a part of what you're going to be teaching. And as you can go then from the collarbone to the what is this called? Sternum. I'm having to dredge up my own school learning here. To the sternum, which is connected to the neck bone, and the neck bone's connected to the chin bone. At any rate, you don't have to be musical about it. But starting with pieces and putting together a whole from that seems to be the way to go with many kids on the spectrum. And given the strong visual processing of kids on the spectrum, it's important in general to teach with pictures. Much less of this writing on the board and much more interacting with images on the whiteboard. The next component is enhanced human resource networks. I've talked about this in an earlier module, but I want to emphasize it. And I've given you an option in your task performance for this week of choosing to learn more about what's called floor time. It was developed by Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and Stuart Shanker is one of the key people who's now directing efforts in research in that regard. And floor time is an alternative to applied behavioral analysis, ABA, which is using operant conditioning, in other words, rewards, to get kids to do appropriate things. And it works. The research supports ABA, but it works for the wrong reasons. The kids do the behaviors to get the rewards. And when they cease to get the rewards, their behavior often diminishes. Floor time, on the other hand, is a more organic, holistic approach to interaction with the child. It's a play-based approach where the mother or the father or the teacher looks for signs in the child of some kind of possibility for social action. So, for example, they may raise up their arm as if they have a sword in their hand. And that's an opportunity for the teacher to come over to the child and say, "Ooh, that's such an interesting sword you've got. What's it made out of? What are you going to do with it? I have a shield in my hand. Do you think your sword could break my shield?" Now, it's kind of a violent metaphor, I realize, but you use what you have, and what you've done is you've created a social interaction. You've gotten the kid to think about what he's doing, what action he's doing, and how it could impact on someone else. And floor time is just a lot of these playful interactions that occur, sometimes lasting just a brief time, other times going on for several minutes at a time. And the research suggests that this is a really powerful approach and helps teach kids on the spectrum self-regulation, particularly when it comes to dealing with meltdowns. Another way of shoring up the social network is through a non-human, in this case, a dog, using dogs to form relationships with kids and vice versa. Remember Temple Grandin's interactions with her cattle and her pigs. Dogs are predictable. They're non-judgmental. You treat them nicely, they'll treat you nicely. And so this can be a really important intervention. Some other people use horses, equine therapy, to help individuals on the spectrum. Also, the use of a mentorship program, pairing a typically developing older person with a younger person on the spectrum, can be an important part of providing a positive role model, getting advice on dealing with social situations, and just generally getting inspired. Affirmative career aspirations. We talked about this earlier when we were referring to the attention to detail as one of the strengths associated with autism. What happened was a firm in Denmark called Specialisterne, which is Danish for the specialists, started hiring people on the spectrum for a particular job that they did. They had contracts with software firms like Microsoft, and their job was to go over to their companies and read their computer program printouts, either the printout or maybe it was on the screen, since we're paperless now for the most part. And the job was to look for mistakes, to look for bugs in the code. And the director of Specialisterne, who had himself an autistic son, recognized the ability of a person with autism to systemize within a computer program, to focus on small details, such as looking for bugs. And so we arranged these internships, or these kind of trips that the workers would take to the companies, and the companies were told to tell their employees not to bug them, to leave them alone, not to mess with their minds, not to use sarcasm, irony, or jokes, or anything that might confuse them. Just let them do their work. And it turns out they do their work 5 times better than typically developing people. And word got around about this experiment, and other software firms around the world started adopting this strategy. Some of them setting a goal to employ at least 1% of their workforce as people on the spectrum. This is really an important development, not just for the field of instructional or information technology, but also for any career out there that does things that match the strengths of not only people on the spectrum, but people in general who are neurodiverse. And it started a dialogue that's happening even as we speak. There's going to be a conference at Stanford in a couple of weeks. I should put some information up about that, where one of the key goals of the conference is to look at this issue of the workforce and how there seems to be a match oftentimes between neurodiverse individuals and the kinds of tasks that we're asking people to do in this new economy, this new service-oriented, high-tech economy. Science seems to be, as Lauren Motrin in the article in Nature pointed out, science seems to be a very good field for many people on the spectrum. Now you might say, well, it's good for our high-functioning people, but there are all sorts of higher order and lower order tasks that can be done. Everything from writing scientific papers at the top to cleaning test tubes at the bottom. So we should think about that as a possibility, because science is all about systems and all about predictability and all about control and looking for details. And I also wanted to point out, we were reading that article from Nature by Lauren Motrin, and one of his chief colleagues, Michelle Dawson, he hired from a job that she originally had as a postal worker, and she came into the lab beginning to do lower order things, but then began to be aware of her intelligence and her capabilities. And over the course of 10 years, she began to read articles exhaustively and even write papers with this chief researcher. So she's really taken off in that regard. But I thought it was interesting that she was a postal worker, because that's a system too. A system that may be breaking down in September, October, November of 2020. I won't go into the political aspects of that, but it is 2020 for those of you that are listening in later dates. But another thing is that Oliver Sacks mentioned Jesse Park as someone on the spectrum. In fact, the first time I learned about autism was around 1974 or 5. I was in Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I heard this lecture given by Clara Claiborne Park, the mother of Jesse Park. And I think Jesse was there too. And the mother had just written a book called The Siege. And I remember the impression I got was that this was a very rare disorder and a very seriously disabling disorder. At any rate, I kind of checked in with Jesse Park recently, not personally, but through the internet, and I discovered she's working as a postal worker in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. But there's this other thing, and she's a creative artist. And if you go online and find her website, you get a sense of some of her beautiful artwork. And there's also something that Oliver Sacks mentioned, and that's the idea of how she mixes up the senses. Her images meld with ideas of morality, with individual emotions and so forth. So she's got a very interesting brain. Temple Grandin has written a book called Developing Talents, Careers for Individuals with Asperger's Syndrome and High Functioning Autism, which I recommend that you get, because she makes some important distinctions in the book about certain groups of and subgroups of individuals on the spectrum, and what would be good in one subgroup wouldn't work with another. Finally, positive environmental modifications. And here we're talking about addressing the issue of sensory sensitivities, for example, to sound. And one modification might be earphones to cut down on the sound level. This is the famous squeeze machine that you read about in the Oliver Sacks New Yorker article this week. It gave Temple Grandin the feeling of being touched, but not too much, and not in an unpredictable human way, but in a way that she could control. And now these are being made and shipped to people all over the world. Less expensive, but really helpful for many kids and teens and adults, are weighted vests, which give that feeling of contact, gentle contact, that makes an individual on the spectrum feel better. And then there's the idea of having sensory rooms, where kids can go in and control their level of sensory input and output, so that they can bounce up and down on a trampoline, snuggle with fluffy pillows, and otherwise engage in what for them would be an optimal level of stimulation. I'd like to leave you, like I did before, with a visualization where you can kind of close your eyes for a moment and visualize a setting that illustrates how you'd like to implement positive niche construction for someone on the autism spectrum. Just take a few moments to see, what would you build? What would you create? How would you bring in social interaction, learning strategies, environmental modifications? Just take a few moments to consider that. And thank you very much for your patience. This has gone over a little longer than I'd anticipated, but there was a lot to say. Thanks a lot.
For further information, get my 2 books on neurodiversity. First of all, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life.